Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive. And let me tell you, I have been looking forward to this one all week.
Oh, absolutely. Same here.
Because today we are examining a piece of pop culture that completely defined a generation. It broke like every box office record imaginable, and somehow, nearly 30 years later, it still has us passionately debating whether two people could have fit on a floating wooden door. We are, of course, talking about James Cameron's 1997 cinematic behemoth, Titanic.
It is truly a cultural touchstone. I mean, everyone knows it. But as we often do here, we're taking a much more analytical approach today. We aren't just going to reminisce about the groundbreaking special effects or how many weeks the soundtrack stayed at #1.
Right. No Celine Dion sing-alongs today.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Our mission for this deep dive is to look at Titanic not merely as a blockbuster Hollywood romance, but as a deeply layered sociological text and a really fascinating, if sometimes pretty flawed, historical document.
Yeah, and to do that, we have pulled together a massive stack of materials. We're looking at dense sociological essays that analyze the film through various academic lenses, extensive historical analyses, and some incredibly detailed, very passionate threads from communities like the Titanic and Rask Historian subreddits.
The people on those forums do not mess around. The level of detail is just wild.
They really don't. And we are going to be synthesizing all of that material for you to separate the historical facts from the Hollywood fiction. We will examine the real-world class conflicts built into the very architecture of the ship. We'll explore the sociological frameworks, specifically Marxist, feminist, and interactionist perspectives that are woven into the fictional romance of Jack and Rose.
Which is so much deeper than I originally thought.
It really is. And finally, we'll be breaking down the baffling historical inaccuracies, as well as the meticulous, surprising accuracies that James Cameron actually put on screen.
So I want to throw a question out to you, the listener. Have you ever wondered why we are all still so obsessed with a ship that sank over a century ago? And how much of what you think you know about the disaster of the RMS Titanic was actually just Hollywood magic? Because as we went through this material, some of the historical realities completely shifted my understanding of the event.
It's one of those cases where the truth is often stranger and honestly, sometimes much more tragic than the fiction. To understand why the story of the Titanic resonates so deeply across generations, we have to start by looking at the ship itself, not just as a feat of engineering, but as a perfect floating microcosm of early 20th century society.
The idea of the ship as a microcosm is so fascinating to me. Some of the sociological essays we reviewed argue that the Titanic was essentially a floating metaphor for capitalism. The ship was literally physically stratified by class.
Yes, right down to the blueprints.
Exactly. When you look at the blueprints, the upper decks represented privilege, total control, and what one of the essayists calls the illusion of stability. They had the grand staircases, the open-air promenades, the natural light. Meanwhile, the lower decks and the boiler rooms represented the massive hidden labor force required to keep the entire capitalist machine moving. Can you break down how that dynamic actually functioned on board?
Sure. If we analyze this through the lens of Marxist conflict theory, which several of our academic sources do in great detail, the ship is just a textbook illustration of the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And just to be clear, we aren't advocating for a specific political ideology here. We're simply using the framework the authors applied to understand the firm's structure.
Right, just reporting on the text.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So in this framework, the wealthy first-class passengers are at the top, enjoying the surplus value generated by the workers at the very bottom. And the labor was staggering. Historians note that the stokers in the boiler rooms were manually shoveling roughly 600 tons of coal a day into those furnaces.
600 tons by hand.
Entirely by hand. They were using heavy iron shovels in a dark, deafeningly loud environment where temperatures routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit.
That is literal hell.
It was backbreaking, hellish work. And the architecture of the ship was specifically designed to ensure that the wealthy passengers on the upper decks never had to see, hear, or even think about that labor force. The working class was physically sequestered. There were separate companionways and hidden corridors specifically for the crew so they wouldn't intrude on the visual perfection of the first-class spaces.
That literal manifestation of out of sight, out of mind brings up one of the most controversial and honestly terrifying elements of the 1997 film, the locked gates.
Ah, yes.
In the movie, we see the third-class passengers trapped deep below deck, desperately shaking these heavy iron grills as the water rises because the crew has locked them down there to ensure the rich people can get on the lifeboats first. It plays like a deliberate homicidal plot. But the historical records you dug into paint a different picture, don't they?
They do. What's fascinating here is that the historical reality is far more complex than the mustache-twirling villain plot. And in many ways, it highlights a much more insidious form of systemic failure. According to the British Inquiry Report of 1912 and extensive discussions among maritime historians, those gates were not installed or locked with the intention of drowning the poor.
Wait, hold on. If it wasn't a deliberate plot by the crew, how do we explain the fact that so many people were trapped behind them? I mean, how does a non-malicious gate turn into a death sentence?
It comes down to bureaucracy and legal compliance. Those gates were actually mandated by United States immigration and quarantine laws.
You're kidding.
No, the White Star Line was legally required to install them to prevent the spread of infectious diseases from the steerage passengers to the upper classes before the ship arrived at the Immigration Processing Center at Ellis Island in New York. Keeping the classes completely segregated was a standard, legally enforced practice of the era.
So they were simply following U.S. law. But surely, in the middle of a sinking, those rules go out the window. Why weren't they opened immediately?
That is where the structural inequality turned fatal. The gates weren't locked out of active malice during the sinking, but the sheer design of the ship and the systemic failures of the crew's emergency response killed them anyway. The inquiry reports highlight a devastating institutional failure. It took a full 47 minutes after the collision with the iceberg for Captain Smith to fully grasp the severity of the damage and give the official order to abandon ship.
47 minutes of just waiting around while water's pouring into the hull.
Yes, because the structural damage was deep underwater, and on the upper decks there was barely a tremor. People were playing with ice on the deck. Because of that massive 47-minute delay, the stewards who were supposed to unlock those grills in the event of an emergency were left without clear orders.
Oh, wow.
By the time the severity of the situation trickled down the chain of command to the lower decks, the ship was already heavily lifting. Power was failing in certain sections, and mass confusion had set in. Many gates remained locked simply out of procedural paralysis, trapping people through institutional negligence rather than active malice.
I saw some numbers in the research regarding survival rates by class, and it looked incredibly grim. Can you break down exactly what the disparity was? Because I think hearing the actual numbers drives the reality of this sociological divide home to you in a way nothing else can.
The statistics are arguably the most damning evidence of how physical location dictated entirely by class-determined survival. Of the first-class passengers, 62% survived. In second class, that number dropped to 41%. In third class, only 25% survived. And the crew had it the worst, with a mere 24% survival rate.
The drop-off from first to third is just staggering. But the statistic that truly stopped me in my tracks when I was reviewing the notes was the children.
It is a chilling disparity. In first class, out of all the children traveling, only one single child died. Her name was Lorraine Allison, and the historical accounts show the only reason she perished was because her parents refused to board a lifeboat while desperately searching the deck for their baby son and his nanny.
Which is heartbreaking.
Tragically, the nanny had already boarded a different lifeboat with the baby. So one child lost in first class due to a tragic misunderstanding. But in third class, 52 out of 79 children died.
52. That is incredibly heavy to process.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it demonstrates the lethal nature of that architectural stratification. First and second class cabins were physically closer to the boat deck. Those passengers had closer proximity to the senior crew, they had better access to accurate information about the severity of the situation, and they simply had less physical distance to travel to reach the lifeboats.
Whereas third class?
The third class passengers were deep in the bowels of the ship, navigating a labyrinth of identical white corridors. Furthermore, many of them were immigrants who couldn't read the English language signs directing them upstairs. The inequality wasn't just in the luxury of their dining rooms. It was fundamentally engineered into their chances of survival.
That physical and societal segregation perfectly sets the stage for the human element of Cameron's film. Let's pivot to the iconic romance of Jack and Rose. At first glance, it just looks like your classic Romeo and Juliet star-crossed lovers trope. Rich girl, poor boy, forbidden love. But the academic sources we reviewed reframe their relationship through a much more complex sociological lens.
Yes, several of the essays we analyzed apply the theories of Pierre Bourdieu, a highly influential French sociologist, to Jack and Rose's dynamic. Specifically, they focus on his concepts of cultural capital and habitus.
Okay, let's unpack this. We all generally know what economic capital is. It's your money, your property, your stock portfolio. But what exactly is cultural capital, and how does Bourdieu's concept of habitus play out on a sinking ship? Can you explain that in a way that doesn't require a sociology degree?
I can certainly try. Think of cultural capital as the non-financial social assets that promote social mobility. It is your education, your intellect, your style of speech, your dress, your manners. It is the mastery of the unspoken rules of a specific class.
Okay, that makes sense. And habitus.
Habitus is essentially the physical embodiment of that cultural capital. Think of it like a psychological fingerprint or a computer's operating system. It's an ingrained worldview, a posture, a way of moving through the world that you were socialized into from birth. You don't even know you're doing it.
So it's not just about knowing which fork to use, it's about the absolute, unquestioning confidence that you deserve to be using that fork. And nowhere in the movie is this more brilliantly illustrated than in the dining scenes. The contrast in the food alone is a masterclass in representing class division.
Let's look at the historical menus provided in the research. The first-class passengers were not just eating, they were partaking in a highly ritualized hours-long display of wealth. We were talking about a 10-course Edwardian French meal. The menus included consommé Olga, poached salmon with mousseline sauce, filet mignon lily, fresh oysters, roast duckling with applesauce. The ingredients were incredibly expensive, sourced globally and prepared by world-renowned chefs.
And then on the flip side, we have the third-class menu. For breakfast, the historical records show they had oatmeal porridge and smoked herrings. For supper, they were literally served gruel, which the sources point out is just a thinner, watered-down, less nutritious version of porridge, alongside cabin biscuits. The only real protein they saw for dinner was a basic roast beef.
Stark contrast.
Huge. The food wasn't just different in cost, it was different in its cultural significance. First-class dining was an art form. Third-class dining was merely caloric intake.
Precisely. And this brings us to one of the most pivotal sociological scenes in the film, when Jack is invited to dine in first class as a reward for saving Rose's life. He is provided with a tuxedo by Molly Brown, the famous unsinkable Molly Brown, who tells him he shines up like a new penny. Jack puts on the suit, and visually he looks the part of a wealthy aristocrat. He even manages to navigate the incredibly complex etiquette of the dinner table, discreetly checking which of the many forks and spoons to use.
He plays the game perfectly. He even leads the conversation. And here's where it gets really interesting. That despite Jack looking like a first-class gentleman and acting appropriately, Rose's mother, Ruth, and her fiancé, Cal, still treat him with complete disdain. One of the passengers explicitly refers to him as a bohemian intruder. Why? I mean, if he's wearing the right clothes and using the right fork, how do they know he doesn't belong?
Because, as Bourdieu's theory of habitus explains, Jack can put on the first-class hardware, the tuxedo, but his software is still third class. He doesn't have the lifetime of subconscious programming that tells him exactly how to hold his posture, how to modulate his voice with that specific mid-Atlantic drawl, or how to project the casual arrogance of the ultra-wealthy.
He hasn't been practicing since birth.
Right. He doesn't have the shared history of boarding schools or summering in Newport. The first-class passengers detect that glitch in his habitus immediately. He can borrow a suit, but he cannot borrow the ingrained cultural markers of their class. The invisible barrier remains entirely intact.
That is such a brilliant way to view that scene. And James Cameron beautifully contrasts that rigid first-class environment with the third-class party that Jack takes Rose to immediately afterward. I notice how the camera work even changes between the two spaces.
It does. In first class, we see a scene where a young girl is being strictly instructed on how to properly fold a napkin and sit with perfect, rigid posture. The atmosphere is repressed, tightly controlled, and practically silent. Every movement is dictated by a suffocating social expectation. But down in third class,
Total opposite.
the music is frantic. It is chaotic, loud, vibrant, and incredibly liberating. There is physical touch, spontaneous dancing on tables, spilled beer, and a total lack of pretense.
Rose is literally suffocating in the first-class world, and the third-class world allows her to actually breathe. But from an interactionist sociological perspective, which another one of our essays dug into society, cannot tolerate them breaking these rules for long, right?
The interactionist perspective argues that massive, macro-level societal inequality is maintained not just by laws, but by micro-level daily interactions between individuals. People are expected to play their assigned roles in the social script. When Jack and Rose step out of their assigned roles by crossing the class divide, society, in the form of Cal, Ruth, and the ship's crew, pushes back aggressively to restore the status quo.
They're ultimately punished for their transgression.
Exactly. When the ship begins to sink, the crew interacts with Jack strictly based on his assigned role as a poor, third-class man. When he is falsely accused of theft, he isn't given the benefit of the doubt or a proper hearing. He is immediately handcuffed to a pipe in the bowels of the ship and treated as entirely expendable. The micro-interactions they experience throughout the film seal their fate during the macro disaster.
That physical suffocation Rose experiences in the first-class dining room perfectly mirrors the societal suffocation she faces, which transitions us beautifully into the next major theme our sources highlighted. We are shifting gears from Marxist and interactionist theories to look at the film through a feminist lens. Because while Jack is suffering under economic oppression, Rose is suffering under the crushing, omnipresent weight of the patriarchy.
Absolutely. The feminist critiques of the film point out that Rose is not treated by her family or her fiancé as a human being with agency. She's essentially a commodity. She is a piece of property being traded on the elite social market. Her family has lost their wealth. Her father left them with nothing but a good name and a legacy of debts. So her mother, Ruth, is essentially selling Rose to Cal Hockley, who is newly rich, steal money to save them from financial ruin and maintain their precarious social status.
Cal makes it explicitly clear that he views Rose as a high-priced acquisition. There is that terrifying scene where he tells her she is his wife in practice, if not yet by law, and demands that she honor him as a wife is required to honor a husband. He literally tries to buy her affection and her obedience with the heart of the ocean diamond.
And the physical symbolism of this oppression in the movie is masterful. The corset scene is frequently cited in the academic literature. There is that incredibly intense moment where Ruth is tightly lacing Rose into a corset, pulling the strings tighter and tighter until Rose gasps that she can barely breathe. It is a visceral, tactile metaphor for the suffocation of the patriarchy and the strict, unrelenting social expectations placed on Edwardian women. They are literally being squeezed, modified, and restricted into a physical shape that a male-dominated society deems acceptable.
That makes Rose's eventual rebellion so much more powerful than just a teenager acting out. The turning point of her character arc, her true awakening, comes in the famous drawing scene.
When she asks Jack to draw her wearing only the heart of the ocean, it is fundamentally not just a romantic or erotic moment. The feminist readings argue it is a profound act of reclaiming her bodily autonomy. She is taking the very symbol of Cal's financial ownership, the unimaginably expensive diamond collar, and subverting its meaning entirely.
She strips away the expensive Edwardian clothes that define her class and restrict her movement, and she uses the diamond as a mere prop in her own personal liberation and artistic expression. She's no longer being looked at as a piece of property. She is taking absolute control of how she is viewed. I love that analysis.
And her ultimate act of defiance isn't just surviving the sinking, it's the life she chooses to build after. When she is rescued by the Carpathia, she hides from Cal on the deck. She gives her name to the official as Rose Dawson, erasing her aristocratic lineage, and she goes on to live this incredibly full, fiercely independent life.
We see those photos panning across her nightstand at the very end of the movie. She is riding horses straddle style in the surf instead of side saddle. She is flying early biplanes. She is acting on stage. She completely shatters the glass ceiling of her era. She refuses to be the tragic, compliant victim her mother and society wanted her to be.
It is a triumphant, fully realized character arc.
Yeah.
However, this discussion of Edwardian gender roles brings up a fascinating and, frankly, quite controversial historical nuance that several of the historical sources spend a lot of time analyzing. And that is the women and children first protocol implemented during the sinking.
Right. It's the ultimate act of maritime chivalry.
It was, and it was strictly enforced, though it's important to note it was interpreted differently depending on which side of the ship you were on. Officer Lightoller, who was loading boats on the port side, interpreted the captain's orders as women and children only. He would literally lower lifeboats with empty seats rather than let a single man board.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. Now, Officer Murdoch, on the starboard side, interpreted it as women and children first, meaning he allowed men to board if there were no women or children immediately waiting in the vicinity.
The survival statistics we talked about earlier reflect that enforcement. Almost all the women and children in first and second class survived, while the vast majority of men, regardless of class, died. But here's where the history takes a really unexpected turn. You would think this profound act of self-sacrifice by the men would be universally praised, but the historical records show there was a massive political backlash regarding the women's suffrage movement. How did that happen?
This raises an important question about the complex intersection of protection and equality in the early 20th century. To be clear, we are simply reporting on the political arguments of the time, not endorsing them. But in the years immediately following the Titanic disaster, anti-suffragists, the political groups actively fighting against women getting the right to vote in the United States and Britain, weaponized the Titanic tragedy.
They used a shipwreck to argue against voting rights.
They did. Their primary argument, published in numerous pamphlets and editorials of the era, was that because women accepted the protection of men on the Titanic, because they accepted those seats in the lifeboats, while men stoically stepped back to die, it proved that women were inherently weaker, more vulnerable, and fundamentally dependent on male sacrifice.
Wow.
The anti-suffragists argued that women couldn't demand political independence, equal voting rights, and a voice in matters of war and state, while simultaneously relying on male chivalry for their basic physical survival in a crisis.
That is wild to consider. To use the survival of those women against them politically, it just shows how deeply entrenched and fiercely defended those gender norms were. It was a massive double-edged sword. You get a seat in the lifeboat, but the patriarchal society uses your survival as proof that you aren't strong enough or independent enough to cast a ballot. That societal pressure, Rose felt, perfectly mirrors the physical pressure happening outside the ship. Which brings us to a part of the story Cameron heavily dramatized, the actual timeline and physics of the sinking. Let's move into section 4 of our material, which looks at cinematic drama versus historical fact. James Cameron is famous for his obsessive attention to detail. He famously went back and changed the starfield in the sky for the 3D re-release because Neil deGrasse Tyson complained it was astronomically incorrect for that time and place.
He really did.
But despite that perfectionism, he took some massive dramatic liberties. And the biggest omission in the entire film, the thing that maritime historians constantly point out, is a ship called the SS Californian.
Yes, the Californian is essentially the ghost ship of the Titanic story. In the 1997 movie, the Titanic seems utterly alone in a vast, terrifyingly empty ocean. It heightens the drama. But in reality, the SS Californian, a much smaller Leyland Line steamship, was only about 10 to 12 miles away, completely stopped in the ice field.
10 miles, that is nothing. You could practically row to it in an hour.
They were so close that the crew standing on the deck of the Californian could physically see the Titanic's emergency flare rockets bursting in the night sky. Yet they did not act. They did not wake up their captain with sufficient urgency, and they did not steam to the rescue.
I just cannot wrap my head around that. How do you stand on a ship, see distress rockets firing into the air from another vessel, and just go back to sleep?
It was a deeply tragic convergence of technological limitations, human error, and bizarre atmospheric conditions. First, we have to look at the radio technology. The Californian only had one wireless operator, a man named Cyril Evans. After a long, frustrating day of warning other ships about the ice and actually being told to shut up by the Titanic's exhausted operators who were busy sending passenger telegrams, Evans had turned off his wireless set and gone to bed at 11:30 p.m., just 10 minutes before the Titanic hit the iceberg. So when the Titanic's operators were frantically tapping out SOS and CQD distress signals, the Californian's radio room was dead silent.
Okay, so the radio was off, but what about the rockets? You don't need a radio to see explosions in the sky.
That is where the environmental conditions come into play. The historical meteorology discussions on the Reddit forums explain this phenomenon beautifully. The captain of the Californian, Captain Stanley Lord, and his officers did see the flashes, but they failed to interpret them as distress signals due to something called a thermal inversion.
What exactly is a thermal inversion, and how does it hide a distress rocket?
Imagine the ocean acting like a giant distorting lens. That night, an unusually warm layer of air was trapped beneath a freezing cold layer of air right above the ocean surface. The incredibly calm, cold air refracted or bent, the light traveling through it. This optical illusion distorted the view of the Titanic from the California. It made the massive Titanic look like a much smaller, closer ship. And when the rockets fired, the refraction made them look like they were bursting very low to the deck, almost like the ship was just setting off small party fireworks or company signals, rather than high-altitude distress flares.
So they literally couldn't trust their own eyes.
The crew of the California was completely confused. They actually tried to signal the mystery ship with a Morse lamp, but the same atmospheric inversion scrambled the light signals, making them unreadable. Believing it was just a small freighter navigating the ice, They did nothing.
And the most frustrating part of this is that James Cameron actually knew about the Californian. The production notes show that he filmed an entire scene showing the Californian stopped in the ice and the radio operator explicitly turning off the set. But he chose to cut it from the final film. His reasoning, which he explained in later interviews, was that he wanted the Titanic to feel like an isolated, inescapable microcosm of the world ending. If you introduce another ship just sitting there on the horizon, it dilutes the dramatic tension. The audience would just be yelling at the screen, "Look over there!" As a filmmaker trying to build unbearable suspense, I completely get it. As a history nerd, it hurts a little.
It is the classic conflict between narrative pacing and historical completeness. Cameron prioritized the emotional truth of the isolation over the historical truth of the proximity. Another fascinating physical reality that night, which the film captures perfectly but rarely stops to explain to the audience, is the state of the water. If you watch the scenes leading up to the collision, the ocean looks like glass. It is completely, unnervingly flat.
Right, there are absolutely no waves. It looks like a black mirror.
And that was historically accurate. Survivors consistently described the ocean that night as a mill pond. But the reason it was so flat is terrifying. It was because the Titanic had sailed into a massive, unprecedented field of ice. The next morning, rescue ships counted over 200 icebergs in the immediate vicinity. This massive concentration of ice essentially trapped the water, killing any swells, wind chops, or waves. And this sheer flatness was the fatal ingredient.
But wait. If the ocean was completely flat and clear, shouldn't the lookouts have seen a massive white iceberg sooner without waves obscuring it?
You would think so, but the opposite is true. On a normal night at sea, even a gentle swell will break against the base of an iceberg. This creates a white, frothy line of phosphorescence glowing water that lookouts can spot from miles away, even in the pitch dark. But because the water was completely still, there were no breaking waves at the base of the berg. Furthermore, while the iceberg was technically a white berg against the dark, star-filled, hazy horizon without any wave action to provide contrast, it appeared to the lookouts as a dark, invisible mass. By the time they saw the silhouette blocking out the stars, they had less than 40 seconds to react.
It was the perfect storm of horrible, anomalous conditions. But speaking of the water, we have to call out one of the most glaring physiological inaccuracies in the movie, the hypothermia timeline. During the climax of the film, Jack and Rose are trying to escape the flooding lower decks. They're wading through waist-deep, 28-degree Fahrenheit water. They are down there for what feels like 30 minutes of screen time, running around, holding their breath to swim entirely underwater through locked gates. And they emerge seemingly totally fine, maybe shivering a little and out of breath.
Yes, from a strict physiological and medical standpoint, that sequence is impossible. Ocean water, that cold, salt water freezes at a lower temperature than fresh water. So it was actually below the freezing point of freshwater leaches. Heat from the human body incredibly fast.
What would actually happen to a person wading through water that cold?
In reality, being suddenly submerged in 28-degree water causes the body to undergo severe cold shock almost immediately. Breathing becomes uncontrollable, leading to hyperventilation and a massive risk of inhaling water. Blood rushes to the core to protect vital organs, meaning the extremities, the arms and legs, lose functionality within minutes. Muscles cramp, fine motor skills vanish, and severe hypothermia would incapacitate a normal human, rendering them unconscious within a very short window. It certainly would not allow for half an hour of athletic underwater swimming. But again, Cameron sacrifices scientific accuracy for narrative momentum. The audience needs to see the heroes actively struggle, solve problems, and escape. Realism would have ended the movie 40 minutes early.
That makes the ending, where Jack succumbs to the cold, much more realistic than their prolonged swimming sequence. Let's pivot slightly and talk about the lifeboats again, because there is a massive, persistent misconception that the greedy White Star Line just didn't want to spend the money to put enough lifeboats on the ship, or that they thought the ship was so unsinkable they just didn't bother. But our historical sources dive deeply into the British Board of Trade regulations of 1912. Why exactly weren't there enough lifeboats for everyone on board?
It wasn't merely a case of corporate greed or unfathomable hubris, though corporate arrogance certainly played a part. The lack of lifeboats was actually based on an outdated set of legal regulations and a fundamentally different philosophical approach to maritime rescue. The Board of Trade rules governing lifeboat capacity were written in 1894 for ships much smaller than the Titanic. The regulations legally capped out at ships of 10,000 tons. The Titanic was over 46,000 tons. The law simply hadn't kept pace with the explosive, rapid growth in ship size over those 2 decades. Technically, the Titanic carried more lifeboats than the law strictly required.
Which is an insane legal loophole. But even if the law didn't require it, why didn't the naval architects just put more on? They clearly had the deck space.
That comes down to the philosophy of rescue. Naval architects at the time assumed that if a massive, modern steel ship with watertight compartments suffered a fatal collision, it would not sink straight down. They assumed it would take on water unevenly and lift or tilt severely to one side.
Right, like it would tip over onto its side before something.
Exactly. And if a ship is listing heavily to the starboard side, for example, you can only safely lower lifeboats from that high starboard side. The lifeboats on the port side would be swinging inward, dragging against the hull, rendering them completely unusable. Therefore, the architects reasoned there was no logical point in cluttering the decks with dozens of extra lifeboats that couldn't physically be launched in an emergency anyway.
That is a terrifyingly logical yet deeply flawed assumption.
Furthermore, and this is crucial to understanding the era, lifeboats were not designed to act as floating hotels. They were never intended to hold the entire passenger and crew list simultaneously while the mothership sank beneath them. They were designed to act as ferries.
Ferries?
Yes. The prevailing assumption was that a ship as robust as the Titanic, with its complex system of watertight doors, would take many hours, perhaps even days, to sink if fatally wounded. The lifeboats would simply ferry a batch of passengers from the stricken liner over to a responding rescue ship like the Californian, drop them off, and row back for more, making multiple trips. The idea that a 46,000-ton Leviathan would suffer catastrophic damage and founder in less than 3 hours in the middle of a vast empty ocean with no rescue ship immediately at hand was a scenario almost inconceivable to the engineering mindset of 1912.
That historical context changes everything. They thought they were building a ferry system for a slow evacuation, not an entire autonomous escape fleet for a rapid plunge. This brings us to one of the more contentious parts of the research. We are looking at character assassinations and unsung heroes. Because while James Cameron was making a fictional Hollywood movie, he was heavily populating it with real historical figures. He used their real names, their real faces, and in some cases, he did their legacies pretty dirty. Let's start with J. Bruce Ismay, the managing director and chairman of the White Star Line. In the movie, he is essentially portrayed as the primary villain. He is the arrogant executive who bullies Captain Smith into lighting the last boilers and speeding up the ship so they can make headlines in New York. And then when disaster strikes, he sneaks onto a lifeboat like a coward while women and children are dying. Is that accurate?
Bruce Ismay is perhaps one of the most vilified men in modern history. The Hearst newspaper syndicate in the United States began a relentless campaign of character assassination against him almost the very moment he stepped off the rescue ship Carpathia. They dubbed him J. Bruce Ismay and ran political cartoons of him surrounded by the ghosts of the dead. But what is fascinating is looking at the actual sworn testimony from our historical sources. Was he guilty of pushing the captain for speed in a dangerous ice field?
I was actually surprised to find out the answer to that is yes. The Reddit historians pulled up the direct, sworn testimony of a first-class passenger named Mrs. Elizabeth Lindsay Lines. She testified under oath at the American Limitation of Liability hearings. She recounted that she was sitting in the first-class lounge, quietly having tea, when Ismay and Captain Smith sat at the table next to her. She overheard Ismay actively dictating the conversation about the ship's speed. He was saying, "We made a better run today than we did yesterday. We will make a better run tomorrow." And then he explicitly stated, "We will beat the Olympic and get into New York on Tuesday." Mrs. Lines described Ismay's tone as definitively dictatorial. So the movie's portrayal of Ismay pressuring the captain isn't just a Hollywood invention. It is firmly rooted in eyewitness historical testimony.
It is. The hubris was real. However, the vilification of Ismay for the act of surviving the sinking is where history and the media have been incredibly unfair to him. The prevailing public narrative was that he disguised himself as a woman, or that he aggressively pushed women and children aside to save his own skin. But multiple eyewitness accounts and officer testimonies confirm that Ismay spent a significant amount of time on the starboard boat deck, actively assisting the officers in loading and lowering several lifeboats. He didn't just hide in his cabin.
So how did he end up in a boat?
When he finally did board a lifeboat, which was collapsible C, it was one of the very last boats to successfully leave the starboard side of the ship. He was standing near the davits, assisting. The boat was actively being lowered. There were no other women or children in the immediate vicinity waiting to board. He simply stepped forward into a vacant seat as the boat went down. Had he not taken that seat, He would have just been another body freezing in the water 20 minutes later, and that specific seat would have remained empty.
But society couldn't accept that. He lived the rest of his life in absolute shame, resigning from his positions and retreating into total isolation in Ireland, because society had decided that the owner of the ship had an absolute moral obligation to go down with it, regardless of empty seats. But if Ismay was treated unfairly by the sensationalist press of 1912, First Officer William Murdoch was treated incredibly unfairly by James Cameron in 1997. This is probably the most controversial historical change in the entire film. In the movie, Murdoch takes a financial bribe from the villain Cal Hockley. He later shoots a passenger who is rushing a lifeboat, and then, overcome with sudden guilt and horror, he sharply salutes and shoots himself in the head.
This specific portrayal caused absolute outrage, particularly in Murdoch's hometown of Dalbeattie in Scotland. They viewed him as a local hero, and the historical record firmly supports that view. Murdoch was instrumental in the evacuation. He was the officer in charge of the starboard side, and he successfully loaded and launched 10 lifeboats, saving hundreds of lives. He was described by numerous survivors as working tirelessly, calmly, and bravely until the water literally washed him off the deck.
So where on earth did Cameron get the idea that he took a bribe and committed suicide?
The bribe was pure Hollywood fiction to show Cal Hockley's corrupt nature. As for the suicide, there were in fact vague rumors and some scattered survivor testimonies, which, as we know, often deeply conflicted in the trauma and chaos of the night, that an unknown officer fired a gun to control the panic in the final moments and subsequently turned the gun on himself. However, there was absolutely no solid evidence linking this definitively to William Murdoch. Many maritime historians believe that if an officer did indeed take his own life that night, it was far more likely to have been Chief Officer Wilde or perhaps Sixth Officer Moody.
But Cameron chose to assign this incredibly dark, tragic arc to Murdoch.
He did, purely for dramatic effect, to give a named, recognizable character a shocking conclusion. The backlash to this creative liberty was so severe that executives from 20th Century Fox actually traveled to Dalbeattie, Scotland, to issue a formal public apology to Murdoch's surviving family and the town. They also made a significant financial donation to a local memorial fund in his name. Cameron himself later publicly expressed deep regret over the portrayal, acknowledging that he took a real, documented hero and thoughtlessly turned him into a flawed cinematic device.
It's a heavy reminder that when you play with real history for entertainment, there are real families and communities who still feel the impact of that narrative. But to be entirely fair to Cameron and his research team, we should also highlight the things he got incredibly, breathtakingly right. The movie captures some real, documented historical heartbreaks with stunning accuracy.
Yes, amidst the fiction, there are profound moments of historical truth. The portrayal of Captain Smith stoically retreating to the bridge, going down with his ship as he realizes the absolute magnitude of his failure, aligns with survivor accounts of his final moments.
And Wallace Hartley and his band. The movie shows them playing music on the deck as the ship goes down, which seems like a cheesy movie trope. But they really did that.
They absolutely did. The 8 musicians really did pull their instruments out onto the freezing, slanting boat deck and play music to keep the passengers calm and maintain a sense of order until the very end. None of them survived. Though, as some of the pedantic historical sources note, they probably played lively, upbeat ragtime music for the vast majority of the night to keep spirits high. Not just the somber hymn, Nearer, My God, to Thee, that is famously depicted as their final song.
And of course, we have to mention the Strausses. Isidor Straus was a wildly successful, wealthy businessman, the co-owner of Macy's department store in New York. Because of his advanced age and high social status, the officer loading the boat actually offered him a seat alongside the women, but Isidor refused, stating unequivocally that he would not go before the younger men on the ship.
And his wife, Ida Strauss, who was already seated in the lifeboat, saw him step back. She immediately stood up and stepped out of the lifeboat, reportedly telling him in front of dozens of witnesses, "We have lived together for many years. Wherever you go, I go." She gave her fur coat to her maid, who survived in the boat and chose to stay behind.
In the movie, Cameron shows them holding each other tenderly in bed as the water violently rushes into their cabin. It is a cinematic moment that makes me cry every single time I see it. In historical reality, they didn't go back to their cabin. They were last seen by survivors sitting quietly together on a pair of wooden deck chairs on the upper boat deck, holding hands and waiting for the end. The physical location in the movie was wrong, but the emotional truth of their sacrifice, their absolute refusal to leave each other, was perfectly, beautifully captured.
It really was.
We are moving into Section 6 of our deep dive, the physics of the fall and modern parallels. Let's talk about the actual mechanics of how this massive Leviathan sank, because this is an area where modern science and forensics have actually updated the movie's iconic narrative.
The visual climax of the 1997 film is unforgettable.
Sure.
The stern of the Titanic, with its massive bronze propellers, rises high into the night sky, reaching a terrifying, dramatic 45-degree angle. The lights flicker and die, plunging the ship into darkness. And then, with a deafening roar of tearing metal, the ship snaps completely in half right down the middle, crashing back into the water before finally slipping vertically beneath the surface.
It is spectacular, terrifying cinema. But according to the deep dive discussions we found, including some incredibly dense, fascinating insights from international communities specifically, there were naval architects debating this on Thai Reddit forums, analyzing the structural physics of the steel. That's not exactly how the ship broke apart.
That is correct. Modern naval architects and marine forensics experts have run extensive computer simulations over the last few decades, utilizing acoustic mapping of the wreckage and stress tests on recovered steel. They've concluded that the ship could not possibly have reached a 45-degree angle in the air. The structural integrity of the ship's steel hull simply couldn't support that much massive weight hanging unsupported out of the water. The scientific consensus now is that the Titanic broke at a much lower, shallower angle, likely between 15 and 23 degrees.
So it didn't stick up out of the ocean like a giant, terrifying obelisk.
Exactly. Furthermore, the mechanics of the break were likely much messier and less cinematic. It didn't cleanly snap top down like a dry twig. The stress simulations suggest the failure actually started at the bottom, at the keel. The ship was essentially being bent over the buoyant force of the water in the middle. The break propagated upwards from the bottom, pulling the ship apart, while a significant portion of the fracture was actually occurring beneath the surface of the water. The stern never rose as high or sheared off as cleanly as the movie depicted.
Now, people on the internet love to point this out as a massive mistake by Cameron, a gotcha moment. But our historical sources actually defend him here. Cameron freely admits the 1997 movie is physically inaccurate by today's forensic standards, but he rightly points out that his dramatic depiction was entirely accurate to the best scientific models and forensic evidence that was available to him in 1995 when he was designing those groundbreaking digital effects. They simply didn't know then what we know now. And honestly, from a purely filmmaking perspective, a 45-degree towering snap against the night sky looks way better on an IMAX screen than a 15-degree partially underwater crumple.
It is a perfect example of artistic license and available science, serving the emotional truth of the narrative over the absolute granular scientific truth of the future. Which brings us to James Cameron's ultimate driving point in dedicating years of his life to making this film. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Cameron wasn't just making a historical documentary with a romance layered on top. He was creating a massive cinematic allegory. The Titanic, in his view, represents the ultimate pinnacle of human hubris. It is the perfect symbol of humanity's blind, arrogant faith that our technology, our engineering, and our amassed wealth can conquer the forces of nature. They declared it practically unsinkable, and nature sank it on its very first trip.
Yes, and Cameron has been very vocal in recent years about how this exact allegory applies to the world we live in today. One of our sociological sources included a fascinating interview quote from him where he explicitly compares the Titanic disaster to the modern crisis of global climate change. To be clear, we aren't here to debate climate policy, but we are reporting on how the director himself explicitly contextualizes his own film. He says that humanity is all on a global ship right now. The wealthy, the politicians, the powerful corporate interests, they are up in the wheelhouse, and they are steering the global ship too fast into dangerous, uncharted ecological waters.
The parallel he draws is striking and undeniably provocative. He argues that when humanity inevitably hits the iceberg of severe ecological disaster, the impacts will not be felt equally across the classes. The wealthy, the first-class passengers of the modern global economy, will have the financial resources, the geographic mobility, the literal and metaphorical lifeboats to survive, relocate, and adapt. Meanwhile, the poorest populations, the developing nations, the global working class, they will be trapped in the lower decks of the crisis. They will face the rising waters, the extreme weather, and the resource scarcity first, with the fewest avenues for escape.
It is a profoundly chilling comparison, and whether you agree with that specific political interpretation or not, it proves exactly why we wanted to do this deep dive today. Let's wrap this up. We started an hour ago by looking at a 1997 blockbuster romance about a drawing and a diamond, but we have unpacked so much more. We've seen how the RMS Titanic serves as a masterclass in representing class struggle, how the physical architecture of a space can forcefully dictate sociological barriers and survival rates, and how deeply ingrained gender roles and patriarchal structures dictated the life and death decisions made in the freezing dark of the Atlantic.
We explored how historical memory is shaped over decades, how genuine heroes can be villainized by sensationalist press or by filmmakers seeking dramatic tension, and how our scientific understanding of a tragedy evolves over time. Most importantly, we've seen how a historical shipwreck from 1912 continues to serve as a chilling, urgent warning about systemic inequality in the face of disaster. I want to thank you, the listener, for joining us on this incredibly expensive, multi-layered exploration of the Ship of Dreams.
It has been an absolute journey, and I'm so glad we got to dig into all of this. But before we sign off, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought, something to chew on long after this deep dive ends. We look back at 1912, and we shudder at the literal iron gits that kept the poor from reaching the lifeboats. We judge the past for being so overtly structurally cruel. But take a look around today. If our global ship hit an iceberg tomorrow, whether it's an environmental collapse, a sudden economic crash, or a new global pandemic, what do the invisible gates of our modern society look like? What are the structures keeping people below deck today? And more importantly, who holds the keys to the lifeboats now? Keep questioning the narratives around you, stay fiercely curious, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.